Oh, and happy birthday.
Thanks, bro.
33-year-old restaurateur Jonathan Chirot is catching up with friends.
John and I spent countless hours together. We shared many stories together, and we were roommates in college. He was like family to me.
But I can't wait for you to see the new site for the restaurant.
Yeah, me too. So excited about it.
Since leaving college, Jonathan has been working in Bluffton's bar and restaurant scene.
Jonathan was always a restaurateur, and he always wanted to be, the best of the best.
He was very perceptive, which made him an insanely good negotiator, and it made him an insanely good friend because he was listening.
It was always just fun to be around. It was always, I would say like an aura. Even if you're having a bad day, he would try and raise you up.
He was just really good at, being around people.
Hey, man, good to see you. How's it going?
I'm doing great.
Later that evening, Jonathan invites another friend, Joe, over for a drink.
You're gonna love this.
Thanks for having me.
It's this new spin on an old classic.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Cheers. So what are we doing tonight?
I think we gotta watch this movie. It's a must-see. It's a must-see.
911, major emergency. My friend's been shot and killed. We're sitting outside and got shot in front of me.
Pinecrest Way, where this incident occurred at, is a beautiful area. We rarely get calls over to this community for any type of criminal offenses, let alone a shooting. The first officer was there within a minute. They draw their guns when they approach the house.
We really don't know whether there's still somebody in the house running around with a gun. The door was open, so we immediately flew in. Who else is in the house?
Inside, officers find the 911 caller and the victim's roommate.
So we were able to get them both out to the front yard area and kind of just sit tight. And we stepped out onto the back patio, and immediately to the left, we saw the deceased kind of slumped over, head kind of on his shoulder.
Officers secure the scene and call in detectives.
When we first got to the scene, myself and my investigators, we began walking around the side of the house towards the backyard of the house. It was rather strange because the victim, he had his legs crossed and he still had his cell phone in his hand. I didn't realize that he sustained any injuries until we walked around and we saw a gunshot wound to the right side of his head.
You're standing in front of somebody that's just been shot to death, kind of like just try to take it in and go, oh my God.
There was blood splatter against the wall of the house. And there was also some shells that went into the garage to the house next to us.
Where the entrance wound was consistent with somebody shooting at him from off in the backyard.
Looking over in the direction where the shots came from, we noticed that there was 2 shotgun shells on the grass right behind the house. And that indicated that that was a position where the shooter was located when he fired the shots.
We got an ID.
The witnesses both confirm the victim's identity as Jonathan Chirot.
Because once you ID the victim, then you can start establishing potential suspects or motives. We had 2 witnesses to the incident. One was sitting on the back porch. He had told us that he was sitting there speaking with the victim when all of a sudden he heard the sound of a shotgun being loaded off in the corner, and then the loud boom go off, at which point he saw his friend's head get snapped back and then blood be splattered across him. He was upset and crying, and the next minute he turned to anger. He wanted us to catch the person right away. So it was an emotional roller coaster for him and what he just experienced, seeing his friend, shot and killed right in front of him. The other one was sleeping in his bed, directly in front of the window where the shot came from.
Detectives begin to canvass the neighborhood for surveillance cameras.
In this case, there was actually a camera about 2 houses down, pointing down the street almost directly at Jonathan's house. We wanted to look at that footage right away.
While officers obtain the footage, investigators reach out to Jonathan's family.
Anytime we have a homicide or a death, we have to go notify the family. And that's always one of the most difficult things to do, to tell his parents that Jonathan was no longer with us, that he was shot.
I think I got a message. I didn't believe it, and I didn't want to believe it. I just remember putting my head in my hands, and I was completely lost it. I was in shock. I remember hearing John's dad's voice and John's mom's voice for the first time after it happened, and it wasn't the voice I recognized, because I recognized it from being jovial and happy. This is what happens when when somebody does something like this, when somebody just takes a life.
Got the surveillance video.
Yeah, put it in.
Surveillance footage from Jonathan's neighborhood comes in.
If there was a vehicle, or if the suspect walked down the sidewalk, potentially he was going to be caught on camera. They had cameras at all the entrances and exits, as well as over by the pool area, looking out into the roadway, which was also directly across from John's house.
They pull up footage from the camera opposite Jonathan's residence.
We know the 911 call came in around 12:40 in the morning.
Let's play just before the murder.
There's no traffic in the area.
Wait, what's that?
As we're watching the footage of John's house, we do see a vehicle that pops into the video. It's right around the same exact time of the shooting.
Given the time of night, given the neighborhoods are very, very quiet around here, you occasionally get some third shift people coming and going from work, but it's rare.
It certainly draws our attention to it. We notice that it's a dark-colored vehicle.
Detectives switch to the next camera, just past Jonathan's house.
Why have they stopped?
They're stopped for about 23 seconds. There was no traffic coming or anything like that. No reason for this to be stopping like that this late at night. So that certainly raised our suspicion.
See if you can find the car in any of their cameras. Okay.
Police follow the car through the whole neighborhood around the time of the murder.
So as we're watching this video, the same vehicle keeps popping up right around the time of the murder. In particular, it's almost like it's doing a full circle around the neighborhood.
Show me the angles we've got.
Detectives look for the clearest image of the vehicle.
Zoom in on the license plate.
Right away, you're like, hey, can we see the tag, the vehicle license plate? Is that legible?
However, the reflection off the plate prevented us from being able to get an actual description of what that plate read.
Rewind, let's see what the make is.
I looked at the front grille, looked at the body lines and the headlights, and I said, yeah, that's definitely a Toyota Camry.
Who owns that vehicle? Because at this point in time, we truly believe that this vehicle had something to do with the murder.
Investigators bring in Jonathan's friend, who witnessed the shooting.
We wanted to speak with Joe Ruby, who was sitting with Jonathan Sherrill in the back porch, and try to get as much as he could recount, not just of the situation, but anybody that he could potentially think of who could be a suspect in the case.
He said something really weird happened or something like that. He said, Kim Murphy said he heard a knock or the doorbell rang. And we looked through and the people and we saw a girl there.
Jonathan told him that earlier in the evening, about 2 hours before, a white female had come over to the house.
She said she had car trouble or something, so she pulled into his driveway, went out and looked at her car. Yes, everything was fine.
He said she tried to make out with him?
Yeah.
He said that she was very flirtatious while he was trying to help her with her car. She was there for about an hour. She got in the car and was able to drive away.
Did you describe the girl to you at all?
He said it was like a girl about his age, I guess decent looking, that's kind of all he said. We were talking about how it was where it's like someone's like trying to chase the house or someone trying to break in or I don't know.
Right.
Whoever this woman was, did she come over to scope out the house? Was this supposed to be a robbery gone bad?
Go to the camera in front of Jonathan's house and fast forward before 11 p.m.
So the story of the mystery woman definitely piqued our interest. We wanted to go back and look at the video to see if there was any truth to this female showing up to the house.
Detectives queue up the footage from 2 hours before the 911 call.
It's just a dog. That's Jonathan.
Yeah, but who's that?
You see a female, fairly tall, slender, female with long blonde hair, with Jonathan out in the front yard with his dog. At this point in time, it was vital for us to identify who this female was. The dog runs across the street, and the female goes after the dog and picks up the dog and actually carries it back to John. As we continue to watch the video, we are able to see that there's some type of interaction going on the front yard to Jonathan's house.
Clearly they were talking, but then you say to yourself, well, was she trying to sell him magazine subscriptions, or did they actually know each other and this was not a chance encounter, possibly?
Police keep watching the footage, hoping to see the mystery woman reappear.
About 50 minutes later, the vehicle goes into reverse and backs out of the driveway.
It's the same car.
You've got a mysterious woman that comes to the house in the vehicle that we've now seen a couple of times, driving slowly back and forth on the night of a murder. It's just odd.
The vehicle starts to drive away from the view of the camera. This was exciting for us because we thought we would be able to get a good visual of the license plate.
I can't make them out.
See if we can get her arriving.
You don't have a vehicle tag to start from. You got to kind of start looking at the little intricacies and nuances of the vehicle as best you can. Can you see any bumper stickers? Then you start looking for, you know, sometimes they'll have a primer colored fender, any dents and dings that are visible. You know, a lot of times those play a huge key.
Hang on. Look at the hubcaps.
So one thing they teach us in law enforcement is when somebody runs away from you, always look at their shoes, because they're never going to change their shoes. They can take off their shirt, they can change their appearance a little bit, but they're never going to change their shoes. So one of my investigators actually took that to heart, and he started looking at the hubcaps. The front passenger side hubcap had a different amount of holes in it than every other hubcap in that vehicle. That one had 7 holes in it, and all the other hubcaps had 6 holes in it. That was very substantial because not all cars are built like that.
Now you're going to start looking for a Camry, in this case, with an abnormality on the front right wheel.
Jonathan's family and friends are desperate to find out who could be responsible for his murder.
A lot of people were looking for answers, and they wanted quick answers. How could this happen here, kind of? That's what was shocking to everybody.
John was one of those people that just made people happy around. He was a fun person to be around. I really enjoyed my time with John, and I just felt cheated. I just feel cheated to this day. And I felt like everything just came crashing down.
Meanwhile, investigators received Jonathan Cherol's cell phone records.
Jonathan Cherol was texting at the time he was murdered. We were able to get a subpoena for that number and find out who the owner was.
Don't mind sitting right over there.
That friend agreed to come into the police department, meet with us, and talk with us about the incident.
You want to help out your friend, right? Yeah, I would like to. You want to find out who killed him?
He tells detectives Jonathan was friendly with a couple who lived nearby.
What's his name? Seth. Anyways, I don't know if that's his real name or not.
One of the persons that lives in the house, he only knows him by the name of Seth, and that he owes Seth money, and that he is not sure if he has paid back Seth yet. He also said that Seth had a wife.
What's his wife's name? Colette.
That got myself and my investigators excited. You know, we wanted to get over to that house as quickly as possible. We would go down the dirt road. We'd see a dark colored vehicle up ahead parked on the side of the street in front of a house.
Sometimes a case will reach that kind of purgatory, kind of limbo phase. We've done everything we can, minus a big break.
Look, the hubcaps.
That's the same car. I'll run the plate and the name.
And the hubcaps certainly matched what we saw in the video, where there was 7 spokes in the front hubcap and 6 in all the others.
That's the vehicle.
Police look into who lives at the address where the car is spotted.
As soon as we saw that DMV photo, I knew we had found our mystery woman.
Let's go.
We knew that we had The same woman who we saw in the video out in front of Jonathan's house right before the murder. That got myself and my investigators excited, thinking that we finally took a good turn for the better. We came up with two names. One was Colette Collins, and the other one was Sam Collins.
They established Seth's real name is Sam Collins.
Colette Collins?
Yes.
I need you to come into the station with us for line of questioning.
Bring her in for an interview, kind of set the tone, kind of let her just speak, dare I say general terms, to just kind of see what road she's going to take you down.
You need anything? Water? I guess you got Pepsi there or something, man.
Yeah, it's almost gone.
You like some bottled water or
Diet Coke?
Diet Coke?
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
When Colette first walks into the interview room, you could tell that she almost seems comfortable.
How do you know him? I know him from Peppers. We used to go up there, we being my husband and I, and we would go to the back bar, and that's how we met John.
Her recollection of the incident was that she had just gotten off work as she's headed home. She comes to an intersection over at Buckwalter, which is right near the Pinecrest subdivision, and feels like she needs to go visit John. She said she hadn't seen John in a while, and so she wanted to go visit him.
Remember what time you got there?
Maybe around 10-ish, or wait, 10:45.
She says she pulled up there around 10:40, so that confirmed that she was the person on the video.
Did he know you were coming by? No, he didn't know. He didn't know.
Besides his presence?
I was on the way home, and I was like, I'm passing his house. I'm just gonna stop by.
What all did y'all talk about?
We just talked about, his restaurant, his parents, what he plans on doing next.
She said she stayed there for about 50 minutes to an hour out in his front lawn. She also talked about how his dog got out, and she chased after the dog, and then she left. She said that she went to a local gas station, purchased some wine.
I know this is a bad call of judgment, but I did open that wine. My husband hasn't had a drink in over a year as of September 1st, and he doesn't like, for me, I don't want to bring it around him, so I kind of rode around and drank on that bottle of wine.
She says after drinking the wine for about an hour, she goes home and goes to bed. We began questioning her accounts of that story, at which point she said that she doesn't remember because she blacked out from all the alcohol she drank. It was strange to us that when we did talk about the murder of Jonathan Sherrill, Colette showed very little emotion. For somebody who was good friends, for somebody who was probably talking with him a couple hours before the murder, you figured that she would be a little bit more upset, but she didn't. And so that was something else that really kind of drew our attention towards her and Sam.
Detectives asked Sam Collins to come to the station.
Sam didn't come until the next morning, and that really got us thinking that, sometimes people will do that because they want to find out what the first person said, corroborate their story.
This one? Yeah. Or actually, no. This one? That one right there to your left. Sorry. There you go. I just want to let you know that you were not in custody and that you were free to leave anytime. Okay. Tuesday night, where were you? I was at home.
He was trying to paint the picture of, see no evil here. I don't know what you're talking about. I was home, trying to create that alibi.
Are you aware that she was over at his house the night he was murdered?
She did mention to me when she came home that she stopped by there.
Okay. Does she normally stop by his house?
That's what I asked her.
Yeah.
And she said no.
Remember what time she came in that night?
I think it was like 1:30 or so. She was drunk.
Sam pretty much said that he was asleep at home all night and that he woke up at 1:30 in the morning when Colette came into the house. She was intoxicated, and that's all that there was to it. We did ask him if he owned a shotgun.
I currently have no weapons or anything like that.
We tried to interview him more, dive deeper into the interview. He said he had nothing more to say.
Would you give us consent to search your house and your vehicle?
No.
You wouldn't give us consent to search your house and vehicle?
No, that's just...
Okay.
Feels like invasion of my privacy.
Before he walked out, he agreed to do a DNA. So we took a sample of his DNA, put it into evidence. So after the interviews with Sam and Colette, we were kind of at a standstill at this point in time. We knew who our primary suspects were. We just needed that one key piece to keep our investigation going.
You're just kind of waiting for that other shoe to drop, and you just have to be patient.
On a traffic stop, one of our police officers stopped Sam Collins.
Is that marijuana I smell in this vehicle?
As he walks up to the driver's side of the vehicle, he can smell marijuana.
Sir, I'm gonna ask you to step out of the vehicle.
During the search of his person, he does find a small bit of marijuana in his pocket, as well as a shotgun shell.
It's one of those holy smokes moments.
We're at a high now, we're hoping the gun is in the car. But we did not find anything else in the vehicle other than that one shotgun shell. Well, nevertheless, during Sam's interview, he tells us he doesn't have a shotgun.
I currently have no weapons or anything like that.
But here he is with a shotgun shell in his pants pocket, which leads us to believe that there is a shotgun somewhere in his house.
That traffic stop is a big break. That's enough for an arrest.
Detectives quickly secure a warrant to search the Collins home.
Colette is in the house. She seems a little surprised that we're there. She was not very helpful whatsoever, kind of disrespectful to police. We noticed there are shotgun holes throughout the house. And there was also a target above the bed with numerous holes in it. That's not something you see every day. It makes you wonder what was going on in that house. We did find something that resembled a shotgun. We realized it was simply a BB gun that the son uses. We did not find any weapons in the house. We did find some shotgun shells, but no shotgun or anything like that that would have helped us, solve this case.
Frustratingly, the shells do not match the type used in Jonathan Chirol's murder.
While we were there, we were able to seize multiple cell phones. We went back to the police department and we separated out I think 2 or 3 cell phones, 2 of which belonged to Sam Collins. My investigator started searching through them. And I won't forget, he came running to my office and said, "You're not gonna believe this." He said, "There is a text message to this number who was actually a friend of Sam's. And the text message was from Sam's cell phone about an hour after the shooting. And it said, 'I put the shotgun back in the back of your truck wrapped in camouflage.'" There was a second text message sent out about 10 minutes later from Sam to that same number to his friend. And it said, "You didn't see me and I didn't see you." And so that was a huge high for us. We immediately got a search warrant for that number.
Investigators track down the man Sam was texting. He tells police Sam returned a shotgun to him the night Jonathan was murdered.
When he was scared for his life, he wanted to borrow that shotgun. It's okay, but it's my baby. Please don't let nothing happen to it. And then one night, I wake up the next morning and I got a message that he had put it in the back of my truck.
And I was like, didn't it rain last night? And I was like, what the heck's he doing? I go back there, and it was still loaded, and the safety was off of it. I'm like, what the hell?
And he told us, well, I have some good news for you. He said, the gun is still in the garage. I haven't touched it. It's still wrapped in the camouflage.
It had the spent round. It hadn't been ejected yet. Because you still have that spent round. I think that spent round's still in the house, too.
To say that we weren't excited is an understatement. So immediately our investigators went into the garage and we saw something laying on the floor, wrapped in a camouflage jacket. It was still on fire. Whoever fired it never put it back on safe. And there was a spent shell casing still in the chamber of the gun. And so now we were at a high, an all-time high, because we truly believed that at this point we had our murder weapon. We bagged it and we sent it straight up to the DNA lab, to the ballistics lab, to compare it to the rounds found at the crime scene.
Detectives re-watched the footage from just before the murder to look for evidence placing Sam Collins at the crime scene.
Every time we review any video, we always catch something more. And so we wanted to have a more in-depth analysis, frame by frame, looking for Sam and any ties that he has to this.
Let's play it again.
What we see was the vehicle drive past Jonathan Sherrall's house, made a left-hand turn onto Masters Way, where it came out of view of the camera, and you see brake lights come on for a brief amount of time. This is not something we caught before, and something that we thought was rather interesting.
It was very foggy and rainy that night to where the camera really accentuated the vehicle brake lights.
This time of the night, with zero traffic on the road and no other traffic in the area, it raised the question, why is this car stopped?
Ten minutes before the shooting, the Collins car stops on Masters Way.
We believe at that point in time was when Colette was dropping off Sam to go and confront Jonathan Sherrall.
Investigators fast forward to just after the shooting.
About 10 minutes later, we saw the vehicle drive up to the intersection after it passed Jonathan Sherrall's house and stood there for about 23 seconds without somebody getting into the vehicle.
She's waiting for Sam.
Made a left-hand turn onto Masters Way and drove down the road. As soon as it gets out of the view of the camera, we see brake lights go on. That led us to believe that Colette was picking them up right after the murder.
Based on the proximity of where the shotgun shells were located in the backyard, where the brake lights, you started to see the brake lights and just kind of timed it and walked it out. Someone could get out of that vehicle, walk through some pine trees, immediately come into the strip of backyards, boom, find the, where the victim and his friend are sitting, pull the trigger a couple of times, and then immediately retreat back. It just all lined up.
DNA and ballistics results come in.
Gapkowitz.
The ballistics came back to a match to the rounds that were found at Jonathan Sherrall's house, the ones that we found in the backyard. There was DNA of Sam's on the buttstock of the shotgun. There was DNA on the trigger of the shotgun. And there was DNA of Sam on the pump. And so we had the murder weapon, and we had only one person's DNA on the gun, which solidified our case.
With Sam still in custody, police charge him with murder and bring Colette in to confront her with their new evidence.
You know, she was a completely different person in the second interview, but she was different because she got caught.
Why did you go over to John's house that night?
I went over there to talk to him and see him. I went over there after work, before I went home, and we just hung outside and talked about everything.
Paulette said that Sam could smell alcohol on her breath and that he was extremely upset that she was coming from John Sherrall's house.
And I had never talked to John without Sam around. So he automatically thought something was up when there wasn't anything, but I was just concerned. I was truly concerned for John.
And he told her, we're going to go confront him right now. So at which point Sam grabbed a shotgun.
And then he was like, well, let's go talk to John. I want to confront him about you. And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. And we rode around, and and I'm like, I don't know what to do at this point. I don't know what to do. And we ended up getting into more of a fight, and I threw my hands up and told him to get out. Get out of my car. And I left. And then he called me and said, I need you to come get me.
She knew that she was caught, and she had to come up with the best story that she could.
I didn't know any of this had happened until I saw it in the news. And I just knew, like, I didn't know what to do. I was scared.
But she wasn't upset for John Sherrall. She wasn't upset for the loss of his life. She was upset because her life was about to be turned around, and she knew it.
Sam Collins is found guilty of murder and is sentenced to 50 years. Colette Collins is charged with accessory after the fact. At trial, she is sentenced to 15 years. No one else was found to be involved in Jonathan's murder.
I'm glad both of them are in jail, and I don't think Sam will ever see the light of day, and he shouldn't because he's a horrible human being.
You went there with the intent to remove him from the planet. And you did that. So you carried out your plan. Well, you took a life, you should get life.
Police now know what happened the night Jonathan Sherrall was murdered.
Colette Collins was on her way home from work. She knew that Jonathan Sherrall was going through a difficult time. She wanted to go over to his house to see how he was doing, spend some time with him. After she spent some time with him, she did stop to get something to drink, some alcohol to drink before she got home. She showed up at home with Sam Collins, who was a jealous husband, did not trust her. And when she came home intoxicated and said where she had come from, Jonathan Sherrall's house, he became enraged. He wanted to go over there and confront Jonathan, and Colette brought him over there.
Colette dropped Sam off at a spot along Masters Way, where unseen by cameras, he is able to slip around the back of Jonathan's house and shoot him. He then runs back through the trees to where his wife picks him up.
And then went home and acted as if nothing happened. Without this video, I'm not so sure we would have solved this case. And it helped us get convictions on both Sam and Colette.
Jonathan Sherrall's murder left a lasting impact on all those that knew him.
I'm angry that John got cheated out of life. I'm angry that his parents had to go through this. I'm angry that his sister had to go through this. It haunts me to this day that I wasn't there to do anything. Even though I probably couldn't have done anything, even though it was out of my control, it haunts me to this day.
I would like John to be remembered as a funny guy. You know, we always would be laughing and joking and stuff like that. A heck of a restaurateur.
He put people together, people loved him, and I know that people miss him today. where he ended was not where he was going. And I will never, ever stop believing that.
I found something suspicious in one of the rooms. What did you find?
We unzipped the sleeping bag. There's a dead body in there.
Did she suffer?
They go into the room and you don't see the victim on video again.
Christmas Eve in Hawaii is not what most people imagine. It is not snow or silence or the hush of winter pressing against the windows. It is warm air that lingers on the skin, salt carried inland by the ocean, and distant lights glowing softly against a dark horizon. In the small communities scattered across the Big Island, the night settles differently. It is quieter in places, almost deceptively so, where the road stretches out without interruption and the only sound is what you bring with you. On the evening of December 24th, 1991, that quiet would become something else entirely. The road in Puna was the kind that disappeared into darkness long before it truly ended. Sparse houses, long gaps between them, and no steady line of streetlights to guide the way. After a certain hour, it became a place where movement felt isolated, where anyone traveling along it existed briefly and then vanished into shadow. There were no crowds, no late-night bustle, no sense of being watched over by a larger world. Just the sound of the ocean somewhere beyond the trees and the steady rhythm of tires moving over pavement. That night, a young woman rode her bicycle along that road. Her name was Dana Ireland. She was 23 years old, moving through a place that, under different circumstances, might have felt peaceful. There was nothing in the moment to suggest what was about to happen. No warning carried in the air, no sign that this stretch of road would soon become the center of one of the most disturbing crimes in the state's history. There are moments in certain cases where time seems to fracture, where everything before and everything after can be separated by a single, irreversible event. This was one of those moments, though no one witnessing the night from a distance would have recognized it as such. Somewhere along that road, something interrupted the quiet progression of her ride. The details, even now, remain incomplete in places, but the evidence left behind would tell part of the story. A bicycle abandoned, a sudden break in motion. The unmistakable indication that what had been ordinary seconds earlier had turned into something violent and uncontrolled. What happened next was not immediate in its conclusion. It unfolded in a way that is difficult to reconcile, not because it is unclear that violence occurred, but because of how long its effects lingered. The attack was severe. It was deliberate. And it left behind a silence that would last for hours. There is a particular kind of absence that follows a crime committed in isolation. No witnesses stepping forward, no immediate response. Just a space where something terrible has already happened, waiting to be discovered. In the case of Dana Ireland, that space stretched through the night. She was left where she fell, injured to a degree that made movement impossible. The road that had once carried her forward now offered nothing. No passing cars, no voices, no interruption to the stillness. It is one of the most difficult aspects of this case to confront, the knowledge that she was still alive. Not for a moment, not for a brief instant, but for hours. Time passed in a way that cannot be fully reconstructed, marked only by the slow transition from night into morning. During that period, there was no rescue, no intervention, no acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. The world continued. Elsewhere, as it always does, families gathered, lights stayed on, conversations carried on into the evening. And on that road, hidden from all of it, the consequences of a brutal attack remained unseen. By the time she was found, the night had already given way to daylight. A passerby came across her body near the roadside, in a condition that made it immediately clear something catastrophic had occurred. She was still alive, but barely. The injuries were severe, the damage extensive. Emergency services responded quickly, but the gap between the attack and her discovery had already taken its toll. She was taken to the hospital, where the effort shifted from rescue to survival. There was no recovery in the sense that most people understand it. She never regained consciousness. The injuries to her body, particularly to her head, were too significant. Days passed, but there was no change, no moment where she woke and spoke. No opportunity to explain what had happened or identify who had been responsible. Eventually, she died from those injuries, and with her, the only direct account of that night was lost. The impact of her death spread quickly through the community. The nature of the crime, its brutality, and the timing on Christmas Eve combined to create a sense of unease that extended beyond the immediate area. This was not a crime that could be easily contained or rationalized. It did not fit neatly into a pattern that people could understand and move past. It raised questions about safety, about randomness, about how something so violent could occur in a place that, for many, felt removed from that kind of danger. In the days that followed, attention turned to the question that inevitably emerges in cases like this: who did this? The urgency of that question was amplified by the circumstances. A young woman attacked without warning. A prolonged period before discovery. A lack of witnesses. Each element added pressure to the investigation, creating an environment where answers were not just sought but expected. And yet, as the investigation began to take shape, it would follow a path that, years later, would be called into question. But in those early moments, before the complexities of the case fully emerged, the focus remained on the immediate tragedy. The loss of Dana Ireland, the violence inflicted upon her, the unsettling reality that such an act could occur without interruption and remain hidden until morning. There is a weight to that kind of realization, a shift in perception that lingers long after the initial shock fades. Cases like this do not begin with clarity, they begin with fragments. A scene that suggests more than it reveals, evidence that points in multiple directions, none of them definitive. And at the center of it all, a victim who cannot speak, whose experience must be reconstructed through the smallest remaining details. In this case, those details would eventually lead investigators toward suspects, toward a narrative that seemed to provide answers. But that narrative, as it would later turn out, was far from complete. What makes the story of this case so enduring is not only the crime itself, but everything that followed. The decisions made in the aftermath, the conclusions drawn from limited information, the confidence placed in accounts that would later be challenged. It is a story that begins with violence but evolves into something more complex, something that forces a reconsideration of how truth is determined and how easily it can be obscured. Looking back now, it is possible to see the early signs of that complexity, even in the initial stages. The absence of direct witnesses, the reliance on interpretation rather than certainty, the pressure to resolve a case that had already captured public attention. Each of these factors would play a role in shaping what came next, but at the center of it all remains that night. A stretch of road in Pune, a bicycle left behind, a young woman who did not make it home. The simplicity of those elements is what makes them so difficult to confront. There is no elaborate setup, no series of events leading gradually toward a known outcome. Just a moment where everything changed, followed by hours of silence, and then the beginning of a search for answers that would stretch across decades. In many ways, the most haunting aspect of this case is not what is known, but what is not. The exact sequence of events, the identity of the person or people responsible, the reasons behind the attack. These are the gaps that remain even after years of investigation and re-examination. They are the spaces where certainty should exist but does not. And so the story begins here, not with resolution, but with uncertainty. With a night that should have been ordinary, transformed into something else entirely. With a victim whose life ended in a way that continues to raise questions. And with an investigation that, from the very beginning, would carry within it the possibility of being wrong. Because sometimes the most troubling part of a case is not just the crime itself, but the realization that the truth, even when pursued relentlessly, does not always reveal itself in the way we expect. To understand what was lost on that night, it is necessary to step back from the violence and look, as carefully as possible, at the life at the center of it. Dana Ireland was 23 years old, an age often associated with beginnings rather than endings. It is a point in life where identity is still being shaped, where choices remain open, and where the future feels less like a fixed path and more like a field of possibilities. There is a particular kind of energy in that stage, a quiet confidence mixed with uncertainty, the sense that life is moving forward even when its direction is not fully defined. There is no need to construct an idealized version of who she was to understand the significance of her loss. What matters is that she existed in the ordinary ways that people do, moving through her days with routines, with plans, with expectations that extended beyond a single night. She lived in Hawaii, a place often described through images of beauty and distance, where the environment itself can feel both open and isolating at the same time. The Big Island, where this case unfolded, is not uniform in its character. It contains areas of development and activity, but also vast stretches where the landscape dominates, where the sense of human presence is minimal. The district of Puna, in particular, carries that contrast in a pronounced way. It is a place defined as much by what is absent as by what is present. The roads extend through areas that are not densely populated, where houses may be separated by long distances, and where the infrastructure that defines urban safety consistent lighting. Frequent traffic, visible community activity simply does not exist in the same way. During the day, this can feel expansive, even peaceful. At night, it becomes something else entirely. The darkness is deeper, the quiet more complete, and the distance between people more apparent. For someone traveling through that area on a bicycle, the experience would be shaped by those conditions. Movement would be steady but exposed. There would be no immediate refuge, no nearby place to step into if something felt wrong. The environment itself would not provide warning, but it would not offer protection either. It is important to understand that context not as a suggestion of inevitability, but as a factor that shaped what could happen without interruption. On December 24, 1991, Dana Ireland was moving through that environment as part of what should have been an ordinary night. There is nothing in the available information to suggest that she anticipated danger or that she was acting outside of normal behavior. The act of riding a bicycle along a road, even one that is quiet, does not inherently signal risk. It becomes dangerous only when something else enters the situation, something unexpected and external. The timing of that night adds another layer to the context. Christmas Eve carries a set of cultural expectations that extend across different places and communities. It is associated with gathering, with familiarity, with a sense of temporary pause from the routines of everyday life. Even in a place like Hawaii, where the climate differs from the traditional imagery of the holiday, the underlying meaning remains. People come together. They stay close to home. They assume, perhaps unconsciously, that the world outside is quieter, less threatening. That assumption is part of what makes what happened to Dana Ireland so difficult to process. The expectation of safety was not unreasonable. It was grounded in the nature of the night itself. And yet, in the specific location where she was, those broader patterns did not translate into immediate protection. The road remained what it always was, isolated, dim, and largely unobserved. There is also a psychological dimension to consider when thinking about how people move through environments like Puna. Familiarity can create a sense of control, even in places that are objectively unpredictable. If a route has been traveled before without incident, it becomes easier to assume that it will remain safe. This is not a failure of judgment, but a natural extension of experience. Most of the time, that assumption holds. Most nights pass without event. Most journeys begin and end without interruption. It is within that framework that the presence of risk becomes harder to detect. There is no clear threshold where a situation shifts from safe to dangerous. There is only the moment when something changes, often without warning. In this case, that moment occurred somewhere along a stretch of road that offered no immediate witnesses and no immediate response. The absence of witnesses is not just a detail of the case, it is central to how it unfolded. In more populated areas, the likelihood of intervention increases, even if only through the presence of others. In Pune on that night, the conditions were different. The isolation that defined the landscape also defined the event. It allowed the attack to occur without interruption, and it allowed its aftermath to remain undiscovered for a significant period of time. That period of time is one of the most critical elements in understanding the context of the case. It is not simply that the attack happened, but that it was followed by hours in which no one knew. Hours in which the normal flow of life continued elsewhere, disconnected from what had taken place. This separation between event and awareness is what gives the case much of its enduring impact. It introduces a gap that cannot be fully bridged, a space where the reality of what happened exists independently of the world's ability to respond to it. When Dana Ireland was eventually found, the context shifted abruptly. What had been hidden became visible. The abstract possibility of danger became a concrete reality. The location that had seemed quiet became the site of a violent crime. This transition from unknown to known is a turning point not only in the timeline of the case, but in how it was perceived by the community. The reaction was shaped by both the nature of the crime and the characteristics of the place where it occurred. In a location like Hawaii, where communities can feel both connected and dispersed, a crime of this nature resonates widely. It challenges assumptions about safety, about predictability, about the boundaries between public and private space. It raises questions that do not have immediate answers, questions about who could have been responsible and how such an act could have taken place without detection. At the same time, the focus on the victim remains essential. It is easy, in the analysis of a case, to shift attention toward the investigation, toward the search for suspects, toward the mechanisms of justice. But before any of that begins, there is the reality of a life interrupted. Dana Ireland was not defined by the event that ended her life, but that event now defines how her story is told. The challenge is to hold both truths at once, to acknowledge the violence without allowing it to become the entirety of her identity. In considering her story, it is also necessary to recognize the limitations of what can be known. There are no recorded words from her about that night, no account of her thoughts, her perceptions, her experience as it unfolded. What exists instead is a reconstruction based on evidence, on physical findings, on the interpretation of what was left behind. This reconstruction is essential, but it is not complete. It cannot fully capture the reality of what she endured. This absence of direct testimony is one of the factors that would later complicate the investigation. Without a clear narrative from the victim, the process of determining what happened becomes more dependent on external sources, on interpretations that can vary and sometimes conflict. It creates a situation where certainty is difficult to achieve, where conclusions may be drawn in the absence of definitive proof. As the case moved forward, these limitations would become increasingly significant. They would influence the direction of the investigation, the identification of suspects, and ultimately the outcome of the trial. But at this stage, in the immediate aftermath, the focus remained on understanding the event itself, on piecing together what could be known from the available evidence. The environment of Pune, the timing of Christmas Eve, the absence of witnesses, and the severity of the attack all combined to create a context that was both specific and unsettlingly open-ended. It was specific in that it occurred in a defined place and time, involving a particular individual. It was open-ended in that it left many questions unanswered, questions that would persist long after the initial shock had faded. In the end, the context of this case is not just a backdrop, but an active component of the story. It shaped the conditions under which the crime occurred, it influenced how it was discovered, and it set the stage for everything that followed, from the investigation to the eventual re-examination of the case years later. Understanding that context is essential, not as a way of explaining the crime, but as a way of recognizing the factors that allowed it to happen as it did. and the challenges that would arise in trying to understand it afterward. The sequence of events that unfolded on the night of December 24, 1991, in the Pune district of the Big Island cannot be reconstructed with absolute precision. But the fragments that remain form a pattern that is both clear in its violence and incomplete in its detail. At some point during her ride, Dana Ireland encountered an interruption that would end the ordinary course of her movement. The road, which had been empty and unremarkable moments earlier, became the setting for an encounter that shifted instantly from routine to crisis. The physical evidence left at the scene provides the first indication of what happened. Her bicycle was found abandoned, no longer in motion, separated from her in a way that suggests a sudden and forceful disruption. This was not a gradual stop or a voluntary pause. The positioning of the bicycle indicated that whatever occurred did so abruptly, without time for preparation or escape. It points to a moment where control was taken from her, where the continuation of her journey was no longer within her ability to determine. What followed was an act of extreme violence. The injuries documented later would make that clear, but even without those details, the circumstances speak to a sustained and deliberate attack. She was subjected to severe physical assault, an act that did not end quickly but unfolded in a manner that caused significant harm. There is also evidence that she was sexually assaulted, adding another layer to the brutality of what occurred. These actions were not incidental. They were part of a sequence that reflects a high level of aggression and disregard for human life. At some point during the attack, she was moved from the immediate roadway into a nearby area of vegetation. This movement is significant because it indicates an attempt to remove her from the most visible part of the environment, even though visibility was already limited. It suggests an awareness, on the part of the attacker or attackers, of the need to conceal what was happening, or at least to reduce the likelihood of being seen. The area into which she was moved was not far from the road, but it was enough to create a barrier between her and any potential passerby. The attack did not result in immediate death. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the case to confront. After the assault, she was left in a condition that was critical but not instantly fatal. She remained alive, though severely injured, in a place where help was not immediately available. The injuries she sustained included significant trauma to her head, among other physical harm, and these injuries would ultimately prove to be fatal. But in the hours following the attack, there was a period during which she was still alive, still present, yet unable to change her circumstances. That period of time is defined by absence. There were no witnesses to intervene, no immediate discovery that could have altered the outcome. The road remained quiet, the environment unchanged, while she lay nearby, injured and alone. The duration of this period is not marked by specific timestamps, but by the transition from night into morning. It is a span that underscores the isolation of the location and the extent to which the event remained hidden. The fact that she could not move is critical to understanding this phase. The injuries she sustained were severe enough to prevent her from seeking help, from returning to the road, or from signaling for assistance in a way that could be detected. This lack of mobility effectively fixed her in place, making the possibility of survival dependent entirely on external discovery. Without that discovery, the outcome was already determined by the severity of her injuries. As the night progressed, the environment around her continued without interruption. The ocean remained in motion, the wind moved through the vegetation, and the road remained largely empty. There is no indication that anyone passed close enough to notice what had occurred. This absence of interaction is not unusual for that area at that time of night, but in this context, it takes on a different meaning. It represents a gap between event and response, a delay that would have significant consequences. When morning arrived, the conditions changed in a way that allowed for discovery. Increased light, the possibility of more people traveling along the road, and the general shift from night to day all contributed to the eventual finding of her body. It was a passerby who first noticed her, recognizing immediately that something was wrong. The severity of her condition would have been apparent even without detailed examination. She was unresponsive, with visible signs of serious injury, and in a position that clearly indicated she had not arrived there by choice. Emergency services were contacted, and the response was initiated. At that point, the focus shifted from discovery to intervention. She was transported to a medical facility as quickly as possible, where efforts were made to stabilize her condition. The transition from the roadside to the hospital represents a critical moment in the timeline, not because it reversed the damage that had been done, but because it marked the first point at which she was no longer alone. In the hospital, the extent of her injuries became fully apparent. The trauma to her head was particularly severe, affecting her ability to regain consciousness. Despite medical intervention, she did not wake. She remained in a comatose state, her condition unchanged in the days that followed. The injuries she had sustained were too extensive to allow for recovery, and there was no opportunity for her to provide an account of what had happened. This absence of testimony would later become one of the defining challenges of the case. Her death occurred after several days in the hospital, a delayed outcome that reflects the severity of the initial attack. It was not a sudden event, but the conclusion of a process that had begun on the road in Pune. The time between the attack and her death is significant because it represents a period during which the possibility of survival still existed, even if it was limited. That possibility, however, was ultimately overcome by the extent of the injuries she had sustained. The confirmation of her death transformed the incident into a homicide investigation, shifting the focus from medical response to criminal inquiry. The location where she had been found became a crime scene, and the process of gathering evidence began in earnest. The physical elements of the scene, the bicycle, the position in which she was discovered, the surrounding environment were all examined for clues that could indicate what had happened and who might have been responsible. The lack of immediate witnesses meant that the investigation would rely heavily on these physical indicators. Each detail took on increased importance, as there were no direct accounts to corroborate or contradict the evidence. The scene itself had to provide as much information as possible, and the interpretation of that information would shape the direction of the investigation. At the same time, the broader context of the incident began to influence how it was perceived. The fact that it occurred on Christmas Eve added a layer of emotional impact that extended beyond the immediate facts of the case. It reinforced the sense that the event was not only violent, but also deeply disruptive to the expectations associated with that time of year. This perception would contribute to the urgency with which the case was pursued. The sequence of events, from the initial interruption of her ride to her eventual death in the hospital, forms a continuous line that defines the incident. It begins with a moment of unexpected contact, escalates into a sustained act of violence, and concludes with a delayed but inevitable outcome. Within that sequence, there are gaps, periods where the exact details are unknown, but the overall structure remains clear. What makes this incident particularly significant is not only the nature of the violence, but the conditions under which it occurred. The isolation of the location, the absence of witnesses, the delay in discovery, and the severity of the injuries all combined to create a situation where the victim was placed in a position of extreme vulnerability. These factors did not cause the attack, but they influenced how it unfolded and how it was experienced. In examining this phase of the case, it is important to maintain a focus on what can be established through evidence while acknowledging the limitations of that evidence. The goal is not to fill in the gaps with speculation, but to understand the sequence as it can be reasonably reconstructed. This approach preserves the integrity of the case while allowing for a clear presentation of what occurred. The incident itself stands as the central event around which all other aspects of the case revolve. It is the point from which the investigation begins, the element that drives the search for answers, and the moment that defines the outcome for the victim. Everything that follows the identification of suspects, the legal proceedings, the later re-examination traces back to this sequence of events on a quiet road in Pune. And yet, even within this central event, there remains an element of uncertainty. The exact number of attackers, the specific actions taken at each stage, the motivations behind the violence, these details are not fully resolved. They exist as open questions shaped by the available evidence but not entirely answered by it. This uncertainty is part of what gives the case its enduring complexity, ensuring that the incident, while clearly defined in its broad outline, continues to resist complete understanding. In the days following the death of Dana Ireland, the focus shifted decisively from what had happened to the question of who was responsible. The investigation began under conditions that were both urgent and uncertain. There was a clear victim, a clearly violent act, and a community that expected answers. What there was not, however, was a direct account of the crime, no witness who could describe the attacker, and no immediate identification of a suspect. The absence of these elements meant that the investigation would depend heavily on interpretation, on assembling a narrative from incomplete pieces of evidence. At the time, the early 1990s, forensic technology was not as advanced as it would later become. DNA analysis existed, but it was not yet the central tool in criminal investigations that it would eventually be. As a result, investigators relied on more traditional methods. They examined the physical scene, collected available evidence, and began the process of identifying individuals who might have had the opportunity or motive to commit the crime. This approach was not unusual, but in a case with limited direct evidence, it carried inherent risks. The pressure to resolve the case was immediate. The brutality of the attack, combined with the circumstances under which it occurred, created a sense of urgency that extended beyond the investigative team. The community wanted reassurance, and that reassurance was often linked to the idea that those responsible would be identified and held accountable. This environment can influence the direction of an investigation, sometimes subtly, sometimes more directly. It can shape the questions that are asked, the leads that are pursued, and the conclusions that are drawn. Within this context, attention turned toward a group of local young men. Among them were Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline. Their connection to the case did not arise from a single definitive piece of evidence, but from a combination of factors that, taken together, appeared to place them within the scope of suspicion. These factors included statements, associations, and interpretations of their potential involvement. The process by which suspects are identified in cases like this is often incremental. Investigators gather information, follow leads, and gradually narrow their focus. In this instance, however, the lack of strong physical evidence meant that the investigation leaned more heavily on statements and confessions. This reliance introduced a level of complexity that would later become central to the case. Some of the statements obtained during the investigation were inconsistent. Accounts changed over time, details were added or omitted, and the overall picture that emerged was not entirely stable. In a different context, such inconsistencies might have prompted a reevaluation of the direction of the investigation. In this case, they were interpreted within a framework that increasingly pointed toward the same group of individuals. There were also indications that some of the confessions or statements may not have been entirely voluntary. The suggestion of coercion, whether through direct pressure or through the circumstances of the interrogation, raises significant questions about the reliability of the information obtained. Confessions are often seen as powerful evidence, but their value depends on the conditions under which they are given and the extent to which they can be corroborated by independent evidence. Despite these concerns, the investigation moved forward with the assumption that the identified suspects were responsible. The narrative that had begun to take shape was reinforced through repeated examination of the same set of statements, creating a feedback loop in which the initial conclusions were supported by the very evidence that had been used to reach them. This is a known risk in investigative processes, particularly in cases where definitive evidence is lacking. The absence of clear physical evidence linking the suspects to the crime scene remained a significant issue. While there were elements that suggested their possible involvement, there was no single piece of evidence that could conclusively place them at the scene at the time of the attack. This gap did not halt the investigation, but it did mean that the case rested on a foundation that was less stable than it might have appeared. As the investigation progressed, the focus narrowed further, Alternative possibilities were considered but not pursued with the same intensity. This narrowing of scope is not uncommon in complex cases, especially when investigators believe they have identified the most likely suspects. However, it can also lead to the exclusion of other potential leads, limiting the overall scope of the inquiry. The role of the community in this phase of the investigation is also important to consider. Information from local residents, whether in the form of tips or general observations, can influence how a case develops. In this instance, the community's awareness of the suspects and their associations may have contributed to the perception that they were connected to the crime. This perception, once established, can be difficult to challenge, even in the absence of definitive evidence. At the same time, the investigation continued to gather and analyze physical evidence from the scene. This included biological material that, at the time, could not be fully utilized due to technological limitations. These materials were collected and preserved, but their significance would not be fully realized until years later, when advances in DNA analysis would allow for more precise examination. The gap between what could be analyzed at the time and what would later become possible is a critical aspect of the case. It highlights the limitations faced by investigators in the early 1990s and underscores the potential for new information to emerge as technology evolves. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, however, these limitations meant that the investigation had to proceed without the benefit of what would later become its most important evidence. The development of the case against the suspects continued, supported by the statements and confessions that had been obtained. These elements were used to construct a narrative of the crime, outlining how it was believed to have occurred and who was responsible. This narrative was not based on a single, clear line of evidence, but on the convergence of multiple pieces of information, each of which carried its own level of uncertainty. Over time, questions began to emerge about the strength of this narrative. The inconsistencies in the statements, the lack of physical evidence, and the circumstances under which the confessions were obtained all contributed to a growing sense that the case might not be as solid as it appeared. These concerns were initially raised by the families of the accused and by individuals who believed that the investigation had overlooked important details. The involvement of legal advocates and independent organizations marked a turning point in the perception of the case. Their role was to examine the evidence, to identify potential errors, and to challenge the conclusions that had been reached. This process did not immediately change the outcome, but it introduced an alternative perspective that would become increasingly significant over time. As these challenges developed, attention began to return to the physical evidence that had been collected, but not fully analyzed. Advances in DNA technology made it possible to revisit these materials and to extract information that had not been accessible at the time of the original investigation. This re-examination would eventually reveal discrepancies between the biological evidence and the individuals who had been identified as suspects. The discovery that the DNA did not match the convicted individuals was a critical moment in the case. It did not provide a complete answer, but it fundamentally altered the understanding of what had happened. The narrative that had been constructed during the initial investigation was called into question, and the possibility that the wrong individuals had been identified became increasingly difficult to ignore. This development did not immediately resolve the case. Instead, it introduced a new set of questions. If the DNA did not match the suspects, then who did it belong to? How had the investigation come to focus on the wrong individuals? And what steps would need to be taken to correct the situation? These questions marked the beginning of a new phase in the case, one that would involve legal challenges, re-examination of evidence, and a reassessment of the original conclusions. The investigation, which had begun with a search for answers, had evolved into a process of questioning its own foundations. The initial certainty had been replaced by doubt, and the path forward was no longer clear. What remained constant, however, was the need to understand what had happened to Dana Ireland and to identify the person or persons responsible. This phase of the case illustrates the complexities of criminal investigations, particularly in situations where evidence is limited and pressure is high. It shows how conclusions can be shaped by the available information and how those conclusions can later be challenged by new evidence. It also highlights the importance of maintaining a critical perspective, even when a case appears to have been resolved. In the end, the investigation into the death of Dana Ireland was not a straightforward progression from crime to solution. It was a process marked by uncertainty, by decisions made under pressure, and by the gradual emergence of information that would change the understanding of the case. The twists and turns that defined this phase would ultimately lead to a re-examination of the entire investigation, raising questions not only about what had happened on that night, but about how the search for answers had been conducted. By the time the case reached the courtroom, much of what had begun as uncertainty had been reshaped into a structured narrative. The investigation had produced suspects, statements, and a version of events that prosecutors believed could explain what happened to Dana Ireland on that night in Pune. The transition from investigation to trial marked a shift in purpose. It was no longer only about finding answers, but about presenting those answers in a form that could withstand legal scrutiny and lead to a conviction. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the statements and confessions obtained during the investigation. These accounts formed the backbone of the argument that specific individuals were responsible for the attack. Among them, Ian Schweitzer emerged as the central figure. His alleged involvement was presented not as an isolated claim, but as part of a broader sequence of events that, according to the prosecution, aligned with the known facts of the case. Alongside him, Sean Schweitzer and Frank Pauline were also implicated, though their roles were framed differently within the overall narrative. The prosecution argued that the crime was not the act of a single individual but involved multiple participants, each contributing in some way to what had occurred. This interpretation was supported by the structure of the statements that had been collected, which described interactions and actions that, taken together, were intended to form a cohesive account. However, the strength of this case depended on the reliability of those statements. From the outset, there were questions about how they had been obtained and whether they could be considered fully credible. Inconsistent details, changes in testimony, and the possibility of coercion all cast doubt on their stability. The defense focused on these issues, arguing that the statements were not a reliable foundation for conviction, particularly in the absence of strong physical evidence. The lack of definitive physical evidence linking the defendants to the crime scene remained one of the most significant challenges in the case. While there was evidence that a violent crime had occurred, there was no clear forensic link that could place the accused individuals at the scene at the time of the attack. This gap was addressed by the prosecution through the use of narrative coherence. The argument was that the statements, despite their inconsistencies, collectively provided a plausible explanation that aligned with the known facts. In the courtroom, this approach required careful presentation. Each piece of testimony was positioned in relation to the others, with the aim of creating a consistent picture. The prosecution emphasized points of agreement between the statements, highlighting areas where different accounts appeared to corroborate one another. The defense, in turn, focused on the contradictions, drawing attention to the ways in which the accounts diverged and questioning the circumstances under which they had been given. The role of the jury in this process was critical. They were tasked with evaluating not only the content of the evidence, but also its reliability. This involved assessing the credibility of the statements, the plausibility of the narrative, and the extent to which the available evidence supported the conclusions being presented. In cases where physical evidence is limited, the interpretation of testimony becomes especially important, and the jury's perception of that testimony can significantly influence the outcome. As the trial progressed, the emotional weight of the case remained present. The death of Dana Ireland was not an abstract fact but a central reality that underscored the proceedings. The severity of the crime, the circumstances under which it occurred, and the impact on the community all contributed to and in which the desire for accountability was strong. This context can shape how evidence is received, even when jurors are instructed to focus solely on the facts presented. Ultimately, the jury reached a decision. Ian Schweitzer was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The other defendants also received convictions, though their sentences differed. The outcome suggested that the prosecution's narrative had been persuasive enough to meet the legal standard required for conviction. At that point, the case appeared to have reached its conclusion. The individuals identified as responsible had been tried and sentenced, and the legal process, in its formal sense, had been completed. However, the conclusion of a trial does not necessarily resolve all questions. In this case, concerns about the reliability of the evidence did not disappear after the verdict. Instead, they continued to surface, raised by the families of the convicted individuals and by those who believed that the investigation and trial had not adequately addressed the uncertainties in the case. These concerns centered on the same issues that had been present from the beginning: the inconsistencies in the statements, the lack of physical evidence, and the possibility that the confessions had not been entirely voluntary. Over time, these concerns led to continued legal efforts to challenge the convictions. Appeals were filed, arguments were made, and the case remained active in a way that extended beyond the initial trial. This ongoing process reflects a broader aspect of the legal system, in which verdicts can be re-examined in light of new arguments or new evidence. It also illustrates the persistence of doubt in cases where the original conclusions are not universally accepted. The development of DNA technology would eventually provide a new dimension to these challenges. Biological evidence collected from the crime scene, which had not been fully analyzed at the time of the original trial, was re-examined using more advanced techniques. The results of this analysis were significant. The DNA did not match the individuals who had been convicted. This finding introduced a level of contradiction that could not be easily reconciled with the existing verdict. The impact of this discovery was profound. It did not simply add a new piece of information to the case. It called into question the entire foundation on which the convictions had been based. If the biological evidence did not link the defendants to the crime, then the reliability of the statements that had formed the basis of the prosecution's case became even more uncertain. The narrative that had been constructed in the courtroom was no longer supported by the available scientific evidence. This development led to a re-examination of the case at a fundamental level. Legal advocates and organizations became more deeply involved, working to present the new evidence and to argue for a reassessment of the convictions. The process was not immediate, and it required navigating the complexities of the legal system, but the direction was clear. The case was no longer considered resolved. In 2017, after years of legal effort, Ian Schweitzer was released from prison, and the charges against him were dismissed. This outcome represented a significant shift from the original verdict. It acknowledged, at least in part, that the case against him could not be sustained in light of the new evidence. The release did not provide a complete resolution to the case, but it marked a recognition that the earlier conclusion had been flawed. The implications of this development extended beyond the individuals directly involved. It raised broader questions about the processes used in the investigation and trial, about the role of confessions in the absence of physical evidence, and about the capacity of the legal system to correct its own errors. These questions are not unique to this case, but they are particularly evident within it. At the same time, the case remained unresolved in a critical sense. The identification of the actual perpetrator or perpetrators was still uncertain. The DNA evidence suggested the involvement of another individual, but that individual had not been definitively brought to justice. This gap between the overturning of the original convictions and the identification of the true offender represents one of the central tensions in the case. The trial and its outcome, therefore, cannot be understood as a simple progression from accusation to conviction to resolution. Instead, it is a sequence that includes initial certainty, subsequent doubt, and eventual reevaluation. Each stage reflects a different understanding of the same set of events, shaped by the information available at the time and the methods used to interpret that information. In examining this phase of the case, it becomes clear that the concept of justice is not always fixed. It can evolve as new evidence emerges and as previous assumptions are challenged. The trial of those accused in the death of Dana Ireland illustrates both the strengths and the limitations of the legal system, showing how it can arrive at conclusions and how those conclusions can later be reconsidered. What remains at the center of this process is the need to align the outcome with the truth of what occurred. The initial trial sought to provide that alignment, but the subsequent developments revealed that it had not fully succeeded. The release of Ian Schweitzer was a step toward correcting that misalignment, but it also underscored the fact that the case, in its most essential sense, was still open. In the years after the courtroom doors closed and the formal language of verdicts and sentences faded into the background, what remained was something less defined but far more enduring. The case of Dana Ireland murder case did not end with a clear resolution. Instead, it extended outward, affecting lives, shaping perceptions, and leaving behind a set of questions that could not be easily answered. It is in this phase, removed from the immediacy of the crime and the intensity of the trial, that the true weight of what happened begins to settle. At the center of that weight is the loss of Dana Ireland. Her life ended not in an instant but through a process that began on a quiet road and concluded days later in a hospital. That progression, from movement to stillness, from independence to complete vulnerability, is difficult to reconcile. It resists simplification. It is not a story that can be reduced to a single moment or a single explanation. It is, instead, a sequence that carries with it the full measure of what was taken. There is a tendency, in cases that receive prolonged attention, for the narrative to shift away from the victim and toward the mechanisms of investigation and justice. The details of legal arguments, the evolution of evidence, and the eventual reassessment of conclusions can come to dominate the story. In this case, those elements are undeniably important, but they exist alongside, not in place of, the original loss. The fact that the case became a subject of legal reconsideration does not change the reality that a young woman's life was ended through violence. At the same time, the experience of those who were convicted and later released introduces another dimension to the aftermath. Ian Schweitzer spent years in prison following a conviction that was later overturned. That period of time cannot be restored or redefined. It represents a segment of life that was shaped entirely by a conclusion that would eventually be called into question. The impact of that experience extends beyond the individual, affecting families, relationships, and the broader understanding of what the case represents. The coexistence of these two realities, the loss of the victim and the wrongful conviction of an accused individual, creates a tension that is not easily resolved. It challenges the idea that justice can be neatly achieved through a single outcome. In this case, the pursuit of accountability led initially to a conclusion that, in light of later evidence, could not be sustained. Correcting that conclusion was necessary, but it did not resolve the underlying question of who was responsible for the original crime. The role of DNA evidence in this process is significant. When the biological material collected from the scene was re-examined and found not to match the convicted individuals, it introduced a level of certainty that had been absent in the original investigation. This certainty did not identify the perpetrator, but it did establish that the narrative presented at trial was incomplete or incorrect. It demonstrated the capacity of scientific advancement to alter the understanding of past events, and it underscored the importance of preserving evidence for future analysis. The introduction of this new evidence also highlighted the limitations of earlier investigative methods. The reliance on statements and confessions, particularly in the absence of corroborating physical evidence, became a focal point of criticism. It raised questions about how those statements were obtained, how they were interpreted, and how much weight they were given in the absence of stronger supporting evidence. These questions are not unique to this case, but they are particularly visible within it, providing a clear example of how investigative practices can influence outcomes. Beyond the specifics of the investigation, the case has contributed to a broader conversation about the nature of justice. It illustrates the idea that legal conclusions are not always final, that they can be revisited and revised as new information becomes available. This capacity for re-evaluation is a strength of the system, but it also reflects the reality that errors can occur. The existence of mechanisms to correct those errors does not eliminate their impact, but it does provide a means of addressing them. In Hawaii, the case became a point of reference for discussions about wrongful convictions and the use of DNA evidence. It serves as an example that is both specific to its context and relevant to broader issues. The combination of a violent crime, an initial conviction, and a later exoneration creates a narrative that is difficult to ignore. It prompts consideration of how similar cases might be approached and how the balance between urgency and accuracy can be maintained. At the same time, the unresolved aspects of the case remain. The identification of the individual whose DNA was found at the scene represents a path toward answers, but not a completed one. Without a definitive conclusion, the case exists in a state of partial understanding. There is knowledge about what did not happen, about who was not responsible, but there is not yet a complete account of what did happen or who was responsible. This gap is a source of ongoing uncertainty, one that continues to shape how the case is perceived. The passage of time does not diminish this uncertainty. Instead, it can deepen it, as the distance between the event and the present makes it more difficult to reconstruct the details with clarity. Memories fade, evidence can degrade, and the context in which the case is understood can shift. These factors do not erase the importance of the case, but they do complicate the process of reaching a final resolution. For those who look back on the events of that night in Puna, the image that remains is not one of closure, but of interruption. A journey that did not reach its destination. A sequence of events that began in ordinary circumstances and ended in violence. A set of decisions made in the aftermath that led to conclusions later challenged by new evidence. Each of these elements contributes to the overall impact of the case, shaping how it is remembered and what it represents. There is also a broader reflection to consider, one that extends beyond the specifics of this case. It concerns the relationship between truth and certainty, between what is known and what is believed. In many instances, these elements align, allowing for a clear understanding of events. In others, they diverge, creating a space where conclusions are drawn in the absence of complete information. The case of Dana Ireland murder case exists within that space, where the search for truth has been ongoing and where certainty has proven elusive. This does not mean that the pursuit of answers is without value. On the contrary, it highlights the importance of continuing that pursuit, of revisiting evidence, of questioning assumptions, and of remaining open to the possibility that new information can change the understanding of what has already been decided. It is a process that requires both persistence and humility, recognizing that the initial interpretation of events may not be the final one. In the end, what remains is not a single narrative, but a collection of perspectives, each shaped by different aspects of the case. There is the perspective of the victim, whose life was ended through violence. There is the perspective of those who were accused and later released, whose experiences reflect the consequences of an investigation that reached the wrong conclusion. There is the perspective of the community, which was affected by the crime and by the subsequent developments. And there is the perspective of the system itself, which must account for both its decisions and its ability to correct them. These perspectives do not converge into a simple resolution. Instead, they exist alongside one another, forming a complex and sometimes conflicting picture. It is within this complexity that the lasting significance of the case can be found. It is not only a story about a crime, but about the processes that follow, about the ways in which those processes can succeed and fail, and about the ongoing effort to align outcomes with reality. The road in Puna remains unchanged in its physical form, but altered in its meaning. It is no longer just a stretch of pavement through a quiet landscape. It is a place associated with an event that continues to resonate, a reminder of what happened and of what has yet to be fully understood. The passage of time has not erased that association, and it is unlikely to do so. In considering the case now, years after the initial events, the most honest conclusion may be that it is not fully concluded. There are elements that have been clarified, errors that have been acknowledged, and steps that have been taken toward correction. But there is also a central question that remains unanswered, one that continues to define the case as much as the events themselves. Who was responsible for what happened to Dana Ireland on that night remains an open question. It is a question that carries with it the weight of everything that followed, from the initial investigation to the eventual reevaluation. It is a question that underscores the limits of what is known and the importance of continuing to seek what is not. And in that unresolved space, the case endures, not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing reflection on the nature of truth, the fallibility of systems, and the lasting impact of a single night that changed everything. There is a point in stories like this where the structure that once held everything together begins to dissolve. The clear divisions between past and present, between what was believed and what was later challenged, start to blur. What remains is not a sequence of events arranged neatly in time, but something more fragmented, more difficult to contain. The case of Dana Ireland murder case does not end in the way most narratives are expected to end. It does not close with certainty, nor does it offer the kind of resolution that allows the story to be set aside. Instead, it lingers, shaped as much by what is missing as by what is known. If there is an epilogue to this case, it exists in that space between conclusion and uncertainty. It is found not in the finality of a verdict, but in the continued presence of unanswered questions. It is found in the recognition that time, while capable of revealing new information, does not always provide clarity. And it is found in the quiet persistence of a story that refuses to settle into a single, definitive form. The passage of time has changed the context in which this case is understood. The events of December 1991 now belong to a different era, one defined by different technologies, different investigative practices, and different expectations of how justice is pursued. The advancements in DNA analysis that played such a critical role in re-examining the case were not available at the time of the original investigation. What was once uncertain became, in some respects, clearer. But that clarity did not extend to every aspect of the case. It illuminated some parts while leaving others in shadow. This uneven illumination is part of what gives the case its enduring complexity. There is now a greater understanding of what did not happen, of who was not responsible. The release of Ian Schweitzer marked a significant shift in the narrative, a recognition that the earlier conclusions could not be sustained. It was a correction, an acknowledgement of error, and an attempt to restore a measure of balance. But correction is not the same as completion. Removing a false answer does not automatically reveal the true one. And so the central question remains: who was responsible for what happened to Dana Ireland on that night in Pune? It is a question that has been asked repeatedly in different forms, across different stages of the case. It has been approached through investigation, through legal argument, through scientific analysis. And yet, despite all of these efforts, it has not been fully answered. There is a particular kind of weight that comes with that kind of uncertainty. It is not the weight of ignorance, but of partial knowledge. Enough is known to understand the seriousness of the crime, the extent of the harm, and the consequences of the decisions that followed. But not enough is known to complete the picture. The missing pieces remain just out of reach, shaping the narrative without fully defining it. For the community in Hawaii, the case has become part of a broader conversation about justice and its limitations. It serves as a reminder that the process of determining truth is not always straightforward, that it can be influenced by factors beyond the evidence itself. It raises questions about how investigations are conducted, how conclusions are reached, and how those conclusions are revisited when new information emerges. These questions do not have simple answers, but they are essential to understanding the case in its full context. At the same time, there is a more personal dimension to the aftermath, one that exists outside of public discourse. It is found in the lives that were directly affected, in ways that cannot be fully captured by legal documents or media coverage. The loss of Dana Ireland is not something that can be revisited or reinterpreted. It is final and changed by the developments that followed. The years that have passed do not alter the reality of that loss, nor do they diminish its significance. Similarly, the experience of wrongful conviction carries its own form of permanence. The years spent in prison, the disruption of life, the impact on identity and relationships, these are not things that can be undone, even when a conviction is overturned. The acknowledgement of error is important, but it does not erase the consequences of that error. It becomes part of the story, another layer that must be considered alongside the original crime. What emerges from this combination of loss and correction is a narrative that resists simplification. It cannot be reduced to a single theme or a single lesson. It is, instead, a reflection of the complexities inherent in the pursuit of justice. It shows how easily certainty can be constructed and how difficult it can be to dismantle that certainty once it has taken hold. It illustrates the role of new evidence in reshaping understanding and the challenges that arise when that new understanding conflicts with established conclusions. There is also a broader implication to consider, one that extends beyond this specific case. It concerns the relationship between time and truth. There is an assumption, often implicit, that with enough time, the truth will eventually emerge in full. That the accumulation of evidence, the advancement of technology, and the persistence of inquiry will lead to a complete and accurate account. In some cases, this assumption holds. In others, it does not. The case of Dana Ireland murder case suggests that time can bring clarity, but not always closure. The idea of closure itself becomes complicated in this context. It is often understood as the point at which a case is resolved, when the responsible party is identified and held accountable. But when that identification remains uncertain, closure becomes less defined. It shifts from a concrete outcome to a more abstract concept, one that may be experienced differently by different people. For some, it may come from the correction of a wrongful conviction. For others, it may remain elusive, tied to the unanswered question of who was responsible. In the absence of complete closure, the case continues to exist in a kind of suspended state. It is not active in the sense of ongoing investigation, but it is not fully resolved either. It occupies a space in which past and present intersect, where the events of that night continue to influence how the case is understood today. This persistence is part of what makes the case significant, not only as an individual story, but as an example of how complex and uncertain the pursuit of truth can be. The physical location where the crime occurred remains unchanged in its essential form. The roads in Pune still stretch through areas of relative isolation, still carry the same sense of distance from more populated regions. But the meaning of that place has been altered. It is no longer just a setting, but a reference point, a location associated with an event that continues to resonate. For those who are aware of the case, the landscape carries an additional layer of significance, one that is not visible but is nonetheless present. In reflecting on this case, it is important to recognize both what has been achieved and what remains unresolved. The re-examination of evidence, the correction of wrongful convictions, and the acknowledgement of investigative limitations represent meaningful developments. They demonstrate the capacity of the system to adapt and to address its own errors. But they also highlight the limits of that capacity, particularly when it comes to achieving a complete and final resolution. What remains, ultimately, is a story that is still in progress, even if its most visible chapters have already been written. It is a story defined by a single night, by the events that followed, and by the ongoing effort to understand both. It is a story that challenges assumptions, that raises questions, and that resists easy answers. And perhaps that is where it finds its most enduring meaning. Not in the resolution that was reached, or the correction that followed, but in the recognition that some questions remain open, that some truths are difficult to fully uncover, and that the pursuit of those truths is an ongoing process rather than a completed task. In that sense, the case does not conclude with a final statement, but with a continuation, an acknowledgement that the search for understanding is not yet finished and may never be in the way we expect. In the end, when the details have been examined, when the timelines have been reconstructed and reconsidered, what remains is not a sense of completion, but a lingering stillness. The case of Dana Ireland murder case does not resolve into a clear conclusion, and perhaps that is what makes it endure. It exists in a space where answers have been partially revealed and partially withheld, where the pursuit of truth has moved forward but has not fully arrived. And in that space, the story continues to echo. It is easy, from a distance, to think of cases like this in terms of milestones. The night of the crime, the discovery, the investigation, the trial, the reversal. Each stage can be identified, labeled, and placed within a broader narrative structure. But when those stages are examined more closely, they begin to blur. The boundaries between them are not as fixed as they appear. The investigation influences the trial shapes public understanding, and the later re-examination reframes everything that came before. What seems linear becomes cyclical, returning again and again to the same central questions. At the heart of those questions is the life of Dana Ireland. It is important to remember that before the case became a subject of analysis, before it entered the language of legal arguments and forensic evidence, it was a life lived in ordinary ways. A life that moved through days without the expectation that it would become the focus of such attention. That ordinariness is part of what makes the loss so profound. It is not defined by extraordinary circumstances, but by the sudden interruption of something that should have continued. The passage of time often changes how events are perceived. Details that once felt immediate become more distant, and the intensity of initial reactions can soften. But in cases like this, time also has the effect of revealing complexity. It allows for reconsideration, for the introduction of new evidence, for the questioning of conclusions that once seemed certain. In this way, time becomes both a clarifying force and a complicating one. It brings new information into focus, but it also highlights the gaps that remain. One of the most significant aspects of this case is the role that those gaps continue to play. The identity of the person or persons responsible has not been definitively established. The sequence of events, while broadly understood, is not complete in its detail. These gaps are not simply absences, they are active elements of the narrative. They shape how the case is discussed, how it is remembered, and how it is understood. They create a sense of incompleteness that cannot be easily resolved. This incompleteness extends beyond the question of identity. It also affects the interpretation of what has already been determined. The overturning of convictions, the introduction of DNA evidence, and the recognition of investigative limitations all contribute to a narrative that is still evolving. Each new piece of information does not simply add to the existing story. It has the potential to change its direction. This dynamic quality is part of what distinguishes the case from those that reach a more definitive conclusion. There is also a broader implication in the way this case challenges assumptions about certainty. In many instances, the legal system is expected to provide clear answers, to establish a definitive account of what happened and who was responsible. When that expectation is not met, it can create a sense of unease. It forces a reconsideration of how truth is determined and how confidence in that truth is maintained. The case of Dana Ireland murder case illustrates that certainty is not always achievable, and that the absence of certainty does not diminish the importance of continuing to seek it. For the community in Hawaii, the case remains part of a collective memory. It is referenced not only as a specific event, but as an example of broader issues. The questions it raises about investigative practices, about the reliability of confessions, and about the role of forensic evidence are not confined to this single case. They resonate in other contexts, influencing how similar cases are approached and understood. In this way, the impact of the case extends beyond its immediate circumstances. At the same time, the personal dimension of the story cannot be overlooked. The loss experienced by those connected to Dana Ireland is not something that can be fully conveyed through analysis. It exists in a different space, one that is not defined by legal outcomes or investigative findings. It is shaped by memory, by absence, by the ongoing presence of something that is no longer there. This dimension of the case is less visible, but it is no less significant. Similarly, the experience of those who were wrongfully convicted remains a part of the story. The years spent in prison, the impact on their lives, and the eventual recognition of error all contribute to the complexity of the case. These elements do not negate the original crime, but they do add another layer to the narrative. They highlight the potential for harm within the system, even as that system seeks to address harm caused by criminal acts. The coexistence of these different elements, loss, error, correction, uncertainty, creates a narrative that resists simple interpretation. It does not align neatly with expectations of justice being served or truth being fully revealed. Instead, it presents a more complicated picture, one in which progress is made but not completed, in which understanding is deepened but not finalized. In reflecting on this case, it is also worth considering the role of memory in shaping how it is perceived. Over time, certain aspects may become more prominent, while others recede. The details that are remembered, the way they are interpreted, and the context in which they are discussed all influence the ongoing narrative. Memory is not static, it evolves, just as the understanding of the case evolves. This means that the story of what happened is not fixed, but continues to be redefined in subtle ways. There is a certain quietness in the way this case persists. It does not demand attention in the same way that more recent events might. It does not have the immediacy of breaking news or the intensity of an active investigation. And yet, it remains present, a reference point that can be returned to, reconsidered, and re-examined. This quiet persistence is part of what gives it its lasting impact. In the absence of a definitive conclusion, the case invites reflection rather than closure. It encourages consideration of what is known and what is not, of what has been achieved and what remains to be understood. It does not provide clear answers, but it does provide a framework for thinking about the complexities of truth, justice, and human experience. The road in Pune, where the events began, continues to exist as it always has. It carries the same physical characteristics, the same sense of distance and isolation. But for those who are aware of what happened there, it also carries something else. It is a place marked by an event that has not been fully resolved, a location that holds within it both the known and the unknown. This duality is part of what defines the case as a whole. In the end, the story does not conclude with certainty, but with an acknowledgement of its own incompleteness. It remains open, not in the sense of being unfinished, but in the sense of allowing for continued inquiry. The search for answers continues, even if it does so quietly, without the urgency that once defined it. And in that continued search, the case finds its enduring relevance, because some stories are not defined by their endings, but by the questions they leave behind. And in the case of Dana Ireland murder case, those questions remain, shaping the narrative, guiding the search for understanding, and ensuring that what happened on that night is not forgotten, even if it is not fully explained. If there is a final way to approach a case like Dana Ireland murder case, it is not by trying to force it into a conclusion it does not naturally reach, but by examining what it leaves behind. Not just the unanswered questions, but the impressions, the shifts in understanding, and the quiet changes in how people think about truth and justice after everything that has happened. Some cases end with certainty, with a name, a verdict, and a sense, whether real or constructed, that the story is complete. This is not one of those cases. Instead, it unfolds as something more complicated, something that continues to exist even after its most visible chapters have passed. It is a case that begins with a violent act, expands into a legal narrative, and then transforms again as that narrative is challenged and partially undone. At each stage, the sense of certainty changes. What once seemed clear becomes uncertain. What once seemed resolved becomes open again. And in that shifting landscape, the meaning of the case itself begins to evolve. At the center of all of this remains Dana Ireland. Her presence in the story is constant, even as the focus moves through different phases of investigation and interpretation. Everything that followed the search for suspects, the trial, the eventual re-examination exists because of what happened to her. It is easy, in the complexity of the case, to become absorbed in those later developments, but they all trace back to a single point, a life interrupted in a way that cannot be undone. There is a particular kind of silence that follows such an interruption. It is not the immediate silence of the night in which the crime occurred, but a longer, more persistent quiet. It is the absence of what should have continued, the absence of a future that will never unfold. This silence does not draw attention to itself, but it is present nonetheless, shaping how the case is remembered and understood. It is a reminder that beyond all the analysis, beyond all the legal arguments, there is something that cannot be restored. At the same time, the case challenges the idea that justice can be neatly defined. The initial trial provided one version of justice, one that was accepted at the time as a resolution. The later discovery of conflicting DNA evidence disrupted that resolution, introducing a different understanding. The release of Ian Schweitzer was an acknowledgement that the earlier conclusion had been flawed. But that acknowledgement did not replace the original narrative with a complete alternative. It created a space in which the idea of justice itself became more complex. This complexity is not a failure in itself, but it does require a different way of thinking. It requires accepting that the process of determining truth is not always linear, that it can involve missteps, corrections, and ongoing uncertainty. It requires recognizing that the presence of an error does not invalidate the entire system, but it does call for careful examination of how that error occurred and how it can be prevented in the future. In this sense, the case becomes not only a story about a crime, but about the structures that respond to crime and the ways in which those structures can be improved. The role of evidence is central to this process. In the early stages of the investigation, the available evidence pointed in a particular direction, or was interpreted in a way that supported a particular conclusion. Later, the introduction of more advanced DNA analysis provided a different kind of evidence, one that carried a level of precision that had not been available before. This shift highlights the importance of scientific development in shaping legal outcomes, but it also raises questions about how cases are handled when such developments are not yet available. There is an inherent tension between the need to act on the evidence available at a given time and the possibility that future evidence may change the understanding of a case. This tension is not unique to this situation, but it is particularly visible here. The decisions made during the original investigation and trial were based on what was known or believed at the time. The later reevaluation was based on new information that was not previously accessible. Both sets of decisions were shaped by their respective contexts, and the interaction between them forms a key part of the case's legacy. Another aspect of that legacy is the way the case continues to influence discussions about wrongful convictions. The experience of those who were convicted and later released serves as a reminder that errors can occur, even in serious cases where the stakes are high. It underscores the importance of safeguards, of independent review, and of maintaining a willingness to revisit conclusions when new evidence emerges. These lessons extend beyond this single case, contributing to broader efforts to improve the fairness and accuracy of the legal system. At the same time, the unresolved nature of the case leaves open the question of accountability. If those originally convicted were not responsible, then someone else was. The presence of DNA evidence suggests that there is a path toward identifying that individual, but the absence of a definitive conclusion means that this path has not yet been fully followed. This gap between what is known and what has been proven in a legal sense is one of the most significant aspects of the case. It represents a space where the pursuit of justice remains incomplete. For those who consider the case now, years after the events themselves, the challenge is to hold all of these elements together. To recognize the loss of Dana Ireland, the impact of the initial investigation, the significance of the later exoneration, and the continuing uncertainty about what truly happened. None of these elements can be fully understood in isolation. They are interconnected, each shaping the meaning of the others. There is also a broader reflection to be made about the nature of truth itself. In many contexts, truth is treated as something fixed, something that can be established and then relied upon. In cases like this, truth appears more dynamic, more resistant to final definition. It is approached through evidence, through interpretation, through revision, but it does not always settle into a single, unchanging form. This does not mean that truth is unknowable, but it does mean that the process of uncovering it can be more complex than expected. The persistence of this case suggests that some stories are defined not by their conclusions, but by their capacity to provoke ongoing thought. They remain relevant not because they are unresolved in a simple sense, but because they continue to raise questions that extend beyond their immediate circumstances. They become points of reference, examples that are revisited when similar issues arise. Reminders of what can happen when certainty is assumed too quickly or when evidence is interpreted without sufficient caution. In this way, the case becomes part of a larger narrative about the relationship between evidence, interpretation, and outcome. It illustrates how each of these elements interacts with the others and how changes in one can affect the entire structure. It shows how the introduction of new information can alter previously accepted conclusions, and how the absence of complete information can leave important questions unanswered. As the story reaches this point, there is no final resolution to offer, no definitive statement that can close the case in a traditional sense. What remains instead is a recognition of its complexity, an acknowledgement of its impact, and an awareness of the questions that continue to surround it. The case of Dana Ireland murder case stands as a reminder that not all stories conclude in the way we expect, and that the search for understanding can continue long after the events themselves have passed. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of all. Not the crime alone, not the investigation, not even the legal outcomes, but the ongoing effort to reconcile what is known with what is not. An effort that continues quietly in the background, shaping how the case is remembered and how it informs the understanding of those who encounter it. There is a moment when looking back at a case like Dana Ireland murder case, when the details begin to recede and what remains is something more abstract, yet more persistent. It is not just the sequence of events or the progression of the investigation, but the imprint those events leave behind. An imprint that does not fade easily, because it is not tied only to what happened, but to what could not be resolved. It exists in the spaces between facts, in the silence that follows unanswered questions, and in the awareness that some parts of the story remain just beyond reach. The road in Pune, where everything began, continues to exist as it always has. It does not change in response to memory or meaning. It does not carry visible markers of what occurred there on that night in December 1991. To someone passing through without knowledge of the case, it would appear ordinary, unremarkable, part of a landscape defined by distance and quiet. But for those who know, the road is not just a place. It is a point of convergence, where a series of events unfolded that would ripple outward for decades. That ripple effect is one of the defining characteristics of this case. It did not remain confined to the moment of the crime or even to the period immediately following it. It extended into the legal system, into the lives of those who were accused, and into the broader understanding of how justice is pursued. Each stage added another layer, another dimension that complicates the narrative rather than simplifying it. At the center of all of this remains Dana Ireland. Her story is not one that can be fully told, because the most critical part of it, what she experienced during those final hours, was never recorded. What exists instead is an outline, a reconstruction based on evidence and inference. That outline is enough to understand the severity of what happened, but it does not provide the full picture. There is a limit to what can be known, and that limit is one of the reasons the case continues to resonate. There is also a sense in which the case reflects a broader tension between certainty and doubt. The original investigation produced a version of events that was accepted as truth, at least within the framework of the legal system. That version led to convictions, to the belief that the case had been solved. But the later introduction of DNA evidence disrupted that certainty, replacing it with doubt. Not a vague or abstract doubt, but a specific, evidence-based challenge to the conclusions that had been reached. This shift from certainty to doubt is not simply a reversal. It is a transformation that changes how every part of the case is understood. The statements that once seemed persuasive are re-examined. The absence of physical evidence takes on greater significance. The process by which conclusions were reached becomes a subject of scrutiny. In this way, the case becomes not just a story about a crime, but a study in how knowledge is constructed and how it can be revised. The release of Ian Schweitzer is one of the clearest markers of that transformation. It represents a moment when the system acknowledged that its earlier conclusion could not be maintained. It is a significant development, but it is also incomplete. It addresses one part of the case, the wrongful conviction, but it does not resolve the question of who was responsible for the original crime. That question remains, and its persistence is central to the ongoing relevance of the case. There is a tendency, when faced with unresolved questions, to seek closure in other forms, to focus on the aspects of the case that have been clarified, to treat the correction of error as a form of resolution. In some respects, this is understandable. The acknowledgement of a wrongful conviction is important, both for the individuals involved and for the integrity of the system, but it is not the same as identifying the person who committed the crime. It is not the same as completing the story. This distinction is important because it highlights the limits of what has been achieved. The case has been partially resolved, but not fully. It has been corrected in some ways, but remains open in others. This partial resolution creates a kind of imbalance, where one set of questions has been addressed while another set remains unanswered. It is within this imbalance that the case continues to exist. The impact of this imbalance extends beyond the specific details of the case. It influences how similar cases are approached, how evidence is evaluated, and how conclusions are drawn. It serves as a reminder that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and that the presence of a narrative does not guarantee its accuracy. These are lessons that emerge from the case, not as explicit conclusions, but as implications that can be applied more broadly. At the same time, the case also raises questions about the role of time in the pursuit of justice. Time can provide distance, allowing for reflection and reevaluation. It can also provide new tools, such as advances in forensic technology, that make it possible to revisit old evidence. But time can also complicate matters, making it more difficult to gather new information, to locate witnesses, or to reconstruct events with precision. It is both an ally and an obstacle, shaping the possibilities of what can be known. In the case of Dana Ireland murder case, time has played all of these roles. It has allowed for the re-examination of evidence and the correction of a wrongful conviction. It has also contributed to the persistence of uncertainty, as the passage of years makes it more difficult to arrive at the definitive conclusion. This dual role underscores the complexity of the case and the challenges inherent in resolving it. There is also a human element to consider, one that exists alongside the legal and forensic aspects. The individuals involved in the case, those directly affected by the crime, those accused, those who participated in the investigation, each carry their own experiences and perspectives. These experiences are not fully captured in the official record, but they are part of the broader reality of the case. They influence how it is remembered, how it is discussed, and how it is understood. For the community in Hawaii, the case remains a reference point, a reminder of an event that challenged assumptions about safety and justice. It is part of a collective memory that extends beyond the specifics of the crime, encompassing the investigation, the trial, and the later developments. This collective memory is not static. It evolves as new information emerges and as perspectives change. It is another way in which the case continues to exist, even years after the events themselves. As the story reaches this final stage, there is no definitive conclusion to offer. There is no single statement that can resolve all of the questions or bring all of the elements into alignment. What remains instead is a recognition of the case in its entirety, with all of its complexities, contradictions, and uncertainties. It is a recognition that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing process, one that does not always lead to a clear or final answer. And perhaps that is the most honest way to understand it. Not as a story with a beginning, middle, and end, but as a sequence of events that continues to unfold in subtle ways. A case that has been examined, challenged, and partially resolved, but not completed. A narrative that invites reflection rather than closure, and that remains present not because it has been fully explained, but because it has not. In that sense, the case of Dana Ireland murder case does not end here. It continues in the questions that remain, in the lessons that can be drawn from it, and in the quiet persistence of a story that refuses to be fully defined. In the final consideration of a case like Dana Ireland murder case, what emerges is not a conclusion in the traditional sense, but a deeper awareness of how fragile certainty can be. The story, after passing through so many phases, begins to settle into something quieter, less about events unfolding and more about what those events leave behind. It becomes less a narrative that moves forward and more a reflection that circles back, returning to the same questions with a fuller understanding of why they remain unanswered. At the center of that reflection is Dana Ireland. Her presence in the case is both immediate and distant. Immediate because everything that has been discussed originates from what happened to her. Distant because the passage of time and the layers of investigation and reinterpretation have placed her story within a broader context that can sometimes obscure the simplicity of what was lost. Yet when everything else is set aside, the essential reality remains unchanged. A young woman set out on what should have been an ordinary path and did not return. That fact does not evolve, does not shift with new evidence or new interpretations. It remains fixed, a point of reference against which all other developments are measured. Around that fixed point, the rest of the case continues to move. The investigation, the trial, the subsequent challenges, and the eventual overturning of convictions all form part of a larger process, one that reflects both the strengths and the limitations of the systems involved. The conviction and later release of Ian Schweitzer illustrates this duality clearly. It shows how a system can arrive at a conclusion with confidence, and how that confidence can later be undermined by new information. It also shows that correction, while necessary, does not erase the consequences of the original decision. This interplay between certainty and doubt is one of the defining characteristics of the case. It is present at every stage, sometimes more visible, sometimes less so, but always influencing how the events are understood. In the early stages, the absence of clear evidence created a space in which interpretations could take on greater weight. During the trial, those interpretations were solidified into a narrative that was persuasive enough to lead to conviction. Later, the introduction of DNA evidence disrupted that narrative, reintroducing doubt where certainty had once existed. The reintroduction of doubt is not, in itself, a resolution. It is a transition, a movement from one understanding to another, without necessarily arriving at a final destination. In this case, that transition has left the story in a state that is neither fully resolved nor entirely open. Certain elements have been clarified, particularly the exclusion of those who were originally convicted. But other elements, most notably the identification of the perpetrator, remain unresolved. This unresolved aspect shapes how the case is remembered and discussed. It prevents it from being categorized simply as a solved or unsolved case. Instead, it occupies a space between those categories, reflecting both the progress that has been made and the work that remains. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the narrative, but a reflection of the reality of the situation. It acknowledges that the pursuit of truth can lead to partial answers, and that those answers can coexist with ongoing uncertainty. There is also a broader implication in the way this case highlights the role of time in shaping understanding. At the moment the crime occurred, the focus was immediate, centered on what had happened and how it could be addressed. As time passed, the focus shifted first to the trial and the establishment of a legal conclusion, and later to the re-evaluation of that conclusion in light of new evidence. Each phase brought with it a different perspective, influenced by the information available at the time and the context in which that information was interpreted. This progression illustrates that understanding is not static. It evolves as new information becomes available and as the context changes. In some cases, this evolution leads to greater clarity and resolution. In others, it reveals complexities that were not initially apparent. The case of Dana Ireland murder case falls into the latter category, where the process of reevaluation has deepened the understanding of certain aspects while also highlighting the limits of what can be known. For the community in Hawaii, the case remains a point of reference, not only for the events themselves, but for the questions they raise. It serves as an example of how investigations can be influenced by the conditions under which they are conducted, how conclusions can be shaped by the available evidence, and how those conclusions can be revisited when new evidence emerges. These lessons are not confined to this case alone. They have broader relevance for how similar situations are approached in the future. At the same time, the personal dimension of the case continues to exist alongside these broader considerations. The loss of Dana Ireland is not something that can be fully captured by the language of legal analysis or investigative procedure. It is a human loss, one that exists beyond the frameworks used to understand it. The years that have passed do not diminish that loss, nor do they change its significance. It remains a central element of the case, one that anchors all other aspects. Similarly, the experience of those who were wrongfully convicted remains an important part of the narrative. The time spent in prison, the impact on their lives, and the eventual recognition of error all contribute to the overall understanding of the case. These elements highlight the potential for harm within the system, even as that system seeks to address harm caused by criminal acts. They add a layer of complexity that cannot be ignored, one that requires careful consideration in any evaluation of the case. As the story reaches this point, it becomes clear that its significance lies not in a final answer, but in the process of inquiry it represents. It is a case that has been examined from multiple angles, that has been revisited and reconsidered, and that continues to prompt reflection. It does not offer a simple lesson, but it does provide a set of questions that remain relevant, questions about how truth is determined, how justice is pursued, and how systems can respond to both success and error. The road in Puna, where the events began, continues to exist as it always has, a physical space unchanged by the passage of time. But its meaning has been altered by what happened there and by everything that followed. It is now associated not only with a specific event, but with the broader narrative that has grown around that event. It serves as a reminder of how a single moment can expand into something much larger, something that continues to influence understanding long after the initial event has passed. In the end, the case does not close in the way that stories often do. It does not arrive at a point where everything is resolved and all questions are answered. Instead, it settles into a state of ongoing reflection, where the known and the unknown coexist. This state is not incomplete in the sense of being unfinished. Rather, it is complete in its recognition of complexity, in its acknowledgement that some aspects of the case may remain unresolved. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand it. Not as a story with a definitive ending, but as a narrative that continues to exist, shaped by the interplay of evidence, interpretation, and time. A narrative that reflects both the pursuit of truth and the challenges inherent in that pursuit. A narrative that, even without a final answer, continues to hold meaning, not only for those directly affected, but for anyone seeking to understand how such cases unfold and what they reveal about the systems and assumptions that surround them. In the final stretch of reflection, when every known detail has been revisited and every development reconsidered, the case of Dana Ireland murder case settles into something that feels less like a conclusion and more like a quiet persistence. It is no longer driven by the urgency that once surrounded it, no longer defined by active investigation or courtroom arguments, but it has not disappeared. Instead, it remains, held in memory, in records, in the ongoing awareness that what happened has not been fully resolved. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes at this stage, a stillness that is not empty but filled with everything that has come before. It carries the weight of the initial violence, the intensity of the investigation, the certainty of the trial, and the disruption of that certainty when new evidence emerged. All of these elements exist together, not in sequence, but simultaneously, shaping how the case is understood in the present. At the center of that stillness is Dana Ireland. Her story does not change with the reinterpretation of evidence or the reevaluation of legal conclusions. It remains as it was, defined by a night that should have passed without incident but instead became something irreversible. The distance in time does not alter that reality. It does not soften the impact or reduce the significance. If anything, it emphasizes the permanence of what was lost. Around that unchanging center, everything else continues to shift. The narrative that once seemed solid has been reshaped, its edges softened by doubt, its structure altered by new information. The conviction of Ian Schweitzer once stood as a definitive answer, a point at which the system declared that responsibility had been assigned. The later overturning of that conviction did not simply revise that answer. It removed it, leaving behind a space that has yet to be fully filled. That space is one of the defining features of the case. It represents not just the absence of a final conclusion, but the presence of an ongoing question. It is a reminder that the process of determining truth can lead to points where certainty is replaced by uncertainty, where answers are reconsidered rather than confirmed. This is not a failure of the process, but an indication of its complexity. It shows that the pursuit of truth is not always a straight path, and that it can involve revisiting and revising earlier conclusions. There is also a sense in which this case illustrates the limits of what can be achieved through investigation and analysis alone. The available evidence, even when examined with the most advanced techniques, provides only a partial picture. It establishes certain facts, excludes certain possibilities, but does not complete the narrative. This limitation is not unique to this case, but it is particularly evident here, where the combination of known and unknown elements creates a narrative that resists closure. For those who look at the case now, the challenge is not to resolve it, but to understand it as it is, to recognize that it exists in a state that is neither fully open nor fully closed, that it contains both clarity and ambiguity. This requires a willingness to accept that some questions may remain unanswered, not because they are unimportant, but because the information needed to answer them is not available. At the same time, the case continues to have an impact beyond its immediate circumstances. It contributes to ongoing discussions about the role of evidence, the reliability of confessions, and the importance of safeguarding against wrongful convictions. It serves as an example of how conclusions can be shaped by the conditions under which they are reached, and how those conclusions can be challenged when those conditions change. In Hawaii, the case has become part of a broader awareness of these issues. It is referenced not only for its specific details, but for what it represents in a larger context. The combination of a violent crime, an initial conviction, and a later exoneration creates a narrative that is both specific and illustrative, one that can be used to examine broader questions about justice and its limitations. At the same time, the personal dimension of the case remains, existing alongside these broader considerations. The loss of Dana Ireland is not something that can be fully encompassed by discussions of legal process or forensic evidence. It is a human loss, one that exists independently of how the case is interpreted or understood. The years that have passed do not change that, nor do they diminish its significance. Similarly, the experience of wrongful conviction remains an integral part of the narrative. The time spent in prison, the disruption of life, and the eventual recognition of error all contribute to the overall understanding of the case. These elements highlight the potential consequences of investigative and judicial decisions. and they underscore the importance of ensuring that those decisions are based on reliable and thoroughly examined evidence. As the case continues to exist in this state of reflection, it also prompts a broader consideration of how stories like this are remembered. Memory is not static, it evolves over time, influenced by new information, changing perspectives, and the passage of years. The way this case is understood today is not the same as it was at the time of the trial, and it will likely continue to change in the future. This ongoing evolution is part of what keeps the case relevant, even as it becomes more distant in time. There is also a sense in which the case serves as a reminder of the limits of narrative itself. Not every story can be told in a way that leads to a clear and satisfying conclusion. Some stories resist that structure, not because they are incomplete, but because the reality they reflect is complex and unresolved. The case of Dana Ireland murder case is one of those stories. It does not fit neatly into the expectations of resolution, and it does not provide the kind of closure that is often sought. Instead, it offers something different. It offers an opportunity to engage with complexity, to consider how different elements interact, and to reflect on the processes through which understanding is developed. It encourages a perspective that values inquiry over conclusion, that recognizes the importance of continuing to ask questions even when answers are not immediately available. In the physical world, the location where the events began remains unchanged. The road in Puno continues to exist as it always has, a quiet stretch of land that does not, in itself, reveal what happened there. But for those who know the case, that location carries an additional meaning, one that is not visible but is nonetheless present. It is a place marked by memory, by association, by the knowledge of an event that has not been fully resolved. In the final consideration, what remains is not a definitive answer, but a recognition of everything that the case encompasses. The crime, the investigation, the trial, the reevaluation, and the ongoing uncertainty all form part of a larger whole. Each element contributes to the overall understanding, and none can be fully separated from the others. And so the case does not end, not in the way that stories are often expected to end. It continues not through new developments, but through the persistence of its questions, through the ongoing reflection it inspires, and through the awareness that some aspects of it may remain unresolved. In that continuation, it finds its lasting significance, not as a story that has been completed, but as one that continues to exist, shaping understanding and prompting thought long after the events themselves have passed. In the long arc of reflection that follows a case like Dana Ireland murder case, there comes a point where the focus shifts once more, not toward resolution, and not even toward the unanswered questions themselves, but toward what those questions reveal about the nature of truth, memory, and justice. By this stage, the details of the case have been revisited countless times, examined from different angles, interpreted through different lenses. What remains is not a lack of information, but a recognition that information alone does not always lead to certainty. This recognition changes how the case is understood. It transforms it from a narrative centered on events into one centered on interpretation. The facts remain the same, but their meaning becomes more complex, shaped by the context in which they are considered. The attack on Dana Ireland is no longer viewed solely as an isolated act of violence, but as the starting point of a much broader process. One that involves not only the search for a perpetrator, but also the examination of how that search is conducted and how its conclusions are formed. There is a certain gravity to that process, a sense that each stage carries consequences that extend beyond the immediate case. The initial investigation, for example, did not simply aim to identify those responsible. It also established a framework for understanding the events. That framework influenced the direction of the trial, the interpretation of evidence, and the perception of the accused. When that framework was later challenged, it did not disappear entirely. Instead, it remained as part of the case's history, a reminder of how conclusions can be shaped by the conditions under which they are reached. The overturning of the conviction of Ian Schweitzer represents a moment where that framework was reassessed, where the earlier understanding was found to be insufficient. But even that reassessment is not a final step. It does not replace one complete narrative with another. It introduces a different perspective, one that acknowledges error without fully resolving the underlying questions. This creates a layered understanding of the case, where multiple interpretations coexist, each reflecting a different stage in the process. This layering is part of what makes the case so enduring. It cannot be reduced to a single version of events because each version is shaped by different information and different assumptions. The original narrative, the narrative presented at trial, and the narrative that emerged after the introduction of DNA evidence all exist within the case, influencing how it is understood even now. None of them can be entirely dismissed, but none of them can be accepted as complete on their own. At the same time, the presence of these multiple narratives does not diminish the central reality of what occurred. The violence inflicted on Dana Ireland remains the defining event of the case. It is the point from which everything else follows, the moment that gives the case its significance. No amount of reinterpretation can change that. It stands as a fixed element within a shifting narrative, a constant against which all other developments are measured. The persistence of that central reality raises questions about how justice is defined and achieved. If the original conviction was incorrect, and if the true perpetrator has not been definitively identified, then what does justice look like in this context? Is it found in the correction of the wrongful conviction, in the acknowledgement of error, or in the ongoing effort to identify the person responsible? The answer is not straightforward, and it may differ depending on perspective. For some, the release of someone who was wrongfully convicted represents a form of justice. For others, the absence of a definitive answer about the perpetrator means that justice remains incomplete. This ambiguity is not easily resolved, but it is an essential part of understanding the case. It reflects the reality that justice is not a single outcome, but a process, one that can involve multiple stages and multiple forms of resolution. In this case, that process has included both the establishment and the dismantling of a legal conclusion, as well as the ongoing search for a more accurate understanding of the events. There is also a broader dimension to this process, one that extends beyond the specifics of the case. It concerns the way in which systems respond to uncertainty, how they manage the tension between the need for conclusions and the possibility that those conclusions may later be challenged. The case of Dana Ireland murder case illustrates that this tension is not easily resolved, and that it requires a balance between confidence in the available evidence and openness to the possibility of error. In Hawaii, this case has become part of a larger awareness of these issues. It is not only remembered for the events themselves, but for the questions it raises about how those events were investigated and interpreted. It serves as a point of reference in discussions about the reliability of confessions, the importance of physical evidence, and the need for mechanisms that allow for the reevaluation of conclusions. These discussions are not confined to this case alone. They have broader implications for how similar cases are approached in the future. At the same time, the personal impact of the case continues to resonate. The loss of Dana Ireland is not something that can be fully captured by analysis or reflection. It exists beyond those frameworks as a human reality that remains unchanged by the passage of time. The years that have passed since the events of that night do not alter the significance of that loss, nor do they diminish its presence within the case. Similarly, the experience of wrongful conviction remains an integral part of the story. The years spent in prison, the impact on personal lives, and the eventual recognition of error all contribute to the complexity of the case. These elements highlight the potential consequences of investigative and judicial decisions, and they underscore the importance of ensuring that those decisions are made with care and supported by reliable evidence. As the case continues to be considered, it becomes clear that its significance lies not in a final resolution, but in the way it continues to provoke thought and reflection. It is a case that resists closure, not because it is incomplete in a simple sense, but because it reflects a reality that is inherently complex. It challenges assumptions about certainty, about justice, and about the ability to fully understand what has happened. The road in Pune, where the events began, remains as it was, a physical space unchanged by the passage of time. But its meaning has been transformed by what occurred there. It is now associated with a case that has extended far beyond that location, a case that continues to be discussed and reconsidered years later. This transformation is part of what gives the case its enduring presence, connecting a specific place to a broader narrative that continues to evolve. In the end, what remains is not a conclusion, but a continuation. The case does not end with a final answer, but with an ongoing process of reflection, one that acknowledges both what is known and what remains uncertain. It is a process that does not seek to simplify the case, but to understand it in all its complexity, recognizing that some aspects may remain unresolved. And in that recognition, the case finds its lasting significance, not as a story that has been completed, but as one that continues to exist, shaping understanding, prompting questions, and reminding those who encounter it that the pursuit of truth is not always a journey with a clear destination, but one that can continue long after the events themselves have passed.